Alrighty, everyone. Welcome to an additional session of the Equity and Mental Health podcast series brought to you by UC San Diego's Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. As always, my name is Kyler Nathan. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a staff and alum of UC San Diego, and it is my pleasure to be hosting this session again with you all. Today, we're being joined by Dr. Jarrel T. Johnson, an assistant professor of higher education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Utah. And today, we're going to be having a conversation centered around his spring session, focusing on building a culture of care, a collective impact approach for holistically supporting Black college men's mental health. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jarrell Johnson to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. I'm excited to just be here with you all and sharing in some more of the richness that I hope was rich to folks when I came in the spring.
Fantastic. And of course, I think that when we introduce people and we give their titles and where they're from, that gives people a snapshot of who they are. But of course, you're a lot more than your title at your institution. So why don't you give folks just a little bit of background on who you are and why your identities and your experiences are important to this topic that we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah. So I'm Jarrell Johnson, right? Black, queer, cisgender man, use he, him pronouns. And for me, this work is so relevant, right, to my own lived experience because being someone who racially identifies as Black and having additional what I call superpower identities that are marginalized, right, through society, but um, I think that all of those identities coalescing around each other present an opportunity for me to think about the ways that I show up, how I experience this world, and the things that impact me all around me. So essentially, I think this topic is an extension of who I am, knowing that I am not the voice of it, but like the a representation for it. And I think this is an exciting opportunity to kind of really bring those things together through my scholarship as now through my personal lived experiences and thinking about too the reality that um, this work that I'm talking about today is something that is personal, but also connected to the research that I've done. And so I'm just excited to just be sharing that with you all today.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on a couple of things you already just said, because I think that as we talk about mental health, as we talk about collective impacts approaches and building a culture of care, I think language is very important in a lot of that. And when
Yes.
you introduce yourself with your identities, I noticed that you use the term superpower. And I think a lot of times when we
Yeah.
talk about certain marginalized communities, sometimes it comes from a deficit perspective. Can you touch on a
Yes.
little bit why you look at some of your identities as superpowers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of me went on this journey of thinking about my identities as a superpower because I failed to mention in my kind of additional kind of context to who I am that I do hold a disability. And so I am ADHD. And so learned about it later on in my time, actually in my first year on the tenure track.
Mm,
And so that was a whole new experience for me, something new that I had to navigate. And I remember trying to make sense of my new diagnosis in 2022 when it was all new to me. I was starting a new faculty role. I was doing getting relaunching projects. Everything was coming at me at once, and then there was this new information about my disability, and so I had to reframe it. And I was telling
mm,
myself, all of these things that I hold in terms of my intersectional identities are superpowers. They allow for me to reshape the narrative around it by figuring out what does this mean for me. And I remember hearing my therapist tell me, she was like, she said, you have to see this as not a disadvantage anymore. Like,
mm.
this is not a disadvantage for you. It's your superpower and you have to learn how to use it. And so I learned that folks who are ADHD tend to be more creative, right? And how to lean into that and how do I leverage that to do the work that I care so much about. And how do I do that with my daily life, right? Like, how do I
Mhm.
make sure that I get creative and challenge myself to make sure that I'm maintaining my relationships with folks and engaging with people on multiple levels. So that's kind of how I got to that point where I was like, this is my superpower. It's not a disability or it's not a thing that's hindering me.
Absolutely. And I just love hearing you describe it in that way because I think that as we talk about this topic of Black college men, I think a lot of times, and at least in my experience to speak from a personal perspective, when we're in collegiate environments, we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Depending on who you talk to, sometimes people talk about the Black male identity in a way that you could tell they're kind of stepping on eggshells a little bit, like thinking that
Mm,
there's this automatic assumption of the different characteristics of a Black male in a college environment. And I think that the more that we treat our students, our peers as
yeah.
superpowers with their different identities, I think it's very essential just to how we have this culture of care. So before we
Yes.
get into the topic deeply, I also want to ask because I noticed in your presentation that you're a HBCU grad, and I think
Yes.
that's a very important framework to this conversation, especially when we look at an institution
Yeah.
like UC San Diego with a smaller Black percentage. What do you feel your HBCU upbringing, graduate from HBCU, why is that important to you, and how does that frame some of this work as well?
Yeah, so a lot of my research is centered around how historically Black colleges and universities become inclusive spaces for queer and trans students. And I tend not to use that as a phrase because I say how historically Black colleges and
Hmm.
universities when I really want to be people centered. And so I am thinking about the administrators, the folks who day in and day out engage with students, not just your typical like student affairs director or someone who is in a leadership role, but even custodians and thinking about their role, the dining staff, right, and their engagement with folks, administrative assistants, all of those folks are such a part of the ecosystem of HBCUs, and sometimes I feel like the work doesn't highlight them as much, right? And
Mm,
so my new kind of mission is really to think about how HBCUs become inclusive spaces with people at the center. And so I think that was connected to my own personal experience, wondering why, as an undergraduate student, I did not feel comfortable to live out as a queer man
mm,
and wanting to see something different in that space, but not always not coming from this deficit standpoint, because there's so much work that's being done that's under the radar at HBCUs. And that type of framing is so important as I think about it in the collective scheme of higher ed, because I think about the work that administrators do on college campuses day in and day out, and how meaningful it can be. I probably would not be sitting here talking to you had it not been for my HBCU experience, the people who actually poured into me, of course, my family, and all the other collective folks who've been such an inspiration to me. But I'm thinking about in terms of my HBCU experience, how important it is to have advocates on campus who see you, who value you, listen to you, and at the same time, do it from a perspective that is, again, seeing us not as a deficit, but also as like an asset, as a superpower that we can tap into when we um, take the time to be intentional with one another.
absolutely. And I think that throughout our conversation, there will be this theme of community, this theme of collectivity. We have the phrase "it takes a village," because as you mentioned, the different folks at different levels of institution. I think back on my time in undergrad and just all of the Black and brown service workers, the custodial staff. When I was, I think, a second or third year at UC San Diego, we one of the maintenance people, his name was Robert. He was an older Black man, and just
Yeah.
whenever he would come to take out the trash or I see him cleaning up, just saying good morning to him and that human centeredness that added to my retention as a student because there's this older Black man on campus. We're building a relationship. That's someone I know that is looking out for me as a student. And I could tell just from that interaction with him that it meant a lot to him as well that I saw him
Yes.
as a human and part of this institution and not just, like you said, kind of like a cog in the machine doing some of the work.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like it humanizes us, right? Like we can get in a state of like, oh, I gotta go in and I gotta do this at this time, or oh, I gotta go to this class at this time. But in the background, our life is happening. So this is always important. It's always at the front of my mind around how do we center people in our everyday kind of approaches to interacting with them.
And in the spirit of centering people, in your presentation, you kind of start the dialogue with humanizing Black college men. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about why this is important as a first step, as a frame for this work that we're doing, and what does it mean to humanize Black college men?
Yeah, I think that's so important, right? Like to think about the intersectional one identities that we hold, and that our experiences as Black men are not monoliths, right? That there are nuances depending on geographical location that you were raised in. There are nuances depending upon your ability status, right? Like you heard me talk about my diagnosis with ADHD. There's differences across the board, right? And if we look at these, nuances in terms of, especially like when you think about ethnicity, the Black American experience looks different than the Black Caribbean experience, right? And
Mhm.
so, like, all of that is what I try to say is get to know these individuals because they're bringing different perspectives and nuances to their lived experiences that oftentimes if we're not careful, we can group all Black men into one category and not really deal with right the particulars of being for myself like Black and queer or someone who holds an ability challenge, right? And so
Mhm.
all of those things I try to do and think about when we say humanizing Blackness, but I also think about it in the context of the ways that we're socialized, right, in
Mhm.
this world and perceived. So the socialization of Black folks in particular, I've noticed that in being in Utah in a predominantly white space, I get sometimes white folks who will say to me, "Hey, I've never really had much interaction with Black folks, right?" And then the interaction that we've had has added a new kind of piece for perspective for them, which is interesting to me because I think that we all do that at some varying degree. We make a judgment about someone that we don't even know, right? Based off of
Mhm.
perceptions or stereotypes or whatever. But until we interact with folks and we actually treat them as human, yeah, that's great. But I also sometimes think about, yeah, it makes sense that some people would not think of Black folks in certain ways because of the ways that maybe they've seen it in the media, right? That's a socialization process, things that they've heard with their families, right? And so that part, but then the other part is that the perception, I think, of Black manhood or masculinity is oftentimes complicated, right? And we don't talk a lot about the ways that our expectation to show up in this world is probably um, I guess, not as engaged with our emotions or in the presentation I talked about as a young kid, right? Like never really noticing messages from multiple sources around how do you take care of yourself, right? How do you pamper yourself? How do you like even saying that sometimes I can see where sometimes when I have those conversations with other Black men, they're like, oh, I never even thought about that, right? And so like, yeah, I'm like, you're a human, you need to take care of yourself. Like if you feel like going to get your feet done, do that, right? Or if you feel like going to go on the shopping spree, do that, or go take yourself on a nice bar date or whatever. Like do that because it's a part of humanizing who you are and not seeing yourself as just this productive person that's supposed to always be contributing to society or a family structure or whatever.
Definitely love that perspective, and it makes me think of a quick, maybe funny story. Hopefully, funny. I like being funny sometimes. But when I was a student, I worked at our Black Resource Center at UC San Diego, and I was a student intern. And there were a group of us, and I think of the six or so interns, two of us identified as Black men. And one
Mm,
of the icebreaker conversations that we had in a meeting was about lotion and the types of lotion we like to wear or utilize.
yeah.
And this was, I was probably like 19 or 20 years old. And myself and the
Mm.
other Black men in the group were like, oh, yeah, we just use Vaseline for men. Like that's what we're supposed to use. But I think as you talk about taking care of yourself, something as little as learning about Black hair and how to take care of our hair, how to take care of our skin,
Hmm.
all of those are things that over time we haven't necessarily been socialized to care about or think about. And I think as we
Yeah.
center us as humans and taking care of us as humans, something as little as getting to know those ways is so important in the long run for as we talk about things like holistic health, because those things taking care of our physical body also attributes to our mental health.
Yes. Yes, yeah, yeah, and I think that's so true, right? Like, I remember being like probably in my late teens, and I started to really get into like skincare stuff. And people wouldn't like make fun of it, but they would make comments. They're like, "Oh, Jarrell's gonna bring all of these like skincare products," and I was like, "Yeah, I want to take care of myself, right?" And I'm still like that to this day, to a point where sometimes I have to tell myself, "I don't need that thing. I have something like this at home," but at the same time, as it was me trying, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was me trying to set the standard with myself to be like, you have to prioritize yourself, because the world will tell you that you punching in and every day, in and out of clocking in and out of work every day is important, right? And just as that is important, I need to be able to take care of myself so I can show up and do that 9 to 5. But even without that, right? Like, I deserve that because I'm a human, right? And I deserve that because I am here, right? And I'm valued. And so um, that's kind of how I approached it, how I think we should be thinking about, or we could be thinking about our mental health and our well-being, is just thinking about how do we center our care and our well-being, even in a world that tells us that that's not important.
Mm, absolutely. And so, as we think about the Black college men's experience in a higher education setting, especially as it pertains to mental health, of course, you and I have this shared identity as Black men, and we talk about Black men as not a monolith, but there still appear to be some themes in Black men's college health experience, their mental health experience. What are some things that we should know about the Black college men's mental health?
Yeah, so I think that, I'm going to start with the good stuff, right? I think that Black college men and Black college students in general have a good sense of what they need, right? So agency is big there. And I think that, there are folks who are deeply rooted in spiritual practices, right? So, for instance, there's a lot of literature that talks about how Christianity and the connection to the church has been such an instrumental process to feeding various parts of their lives, especially when you think about mental health. The ways that community is so important for Black students, and the way that they form that in spaces, especially when they're challenged with various forms of dynamics around power and oppression. Thinking about the ways that folks show up and create community within that to take care of each other, and also thinking about too, being able to navigate situations that are external, right, to their college experience, but have implications for that college experience. So in the presentation, I talked about just some of the pressures, right, that Black college men face around supporting families, right? Back home could be local or from afar, right? Having that pressure, navigating financial obligations for school and otherwise, right? The navigation of racism. I have a colleague at the University of Utah, Dr. William Smith, who does a whole scheme of work around um, racial battle fatigue, right? And what does that do when students have to encounter racist incidents to their mental health, to their
Mm,
psyche, and their overall health, right? Like, we talk about mental health as like a distant or a separate or detached kind of entity of our lives, but they do have interconnected ways in which they show up. Folks will tell you, right? The research will tell you that mental health, the way one's mental health is cared for or not, has implications for their overall health, right? And so I think of that college men having such a huge opportunity to leverage all of the resources around them, but also having to combat that alongside some of the most systemic barriers and challenges. And it makes me worried, especially across the nation, as we see these anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion bans come into
mhm.
play from the states, that we're going to have to be more intentional, like even more intentional than what we have been, to serve students, because they will find other ways, right, or have to find other ways to access those resources if they're not on those campuses. So There are nuances, but there are opportunities, right? And it looks different depending on what identities one might hold. Black and queer, for instance, might look different than a cis straight man, right? Black man, but there's some commonalities. And then I think the large one before I end on this point is that within the larger context of the Black community, there's always been the stigma around accessing mental health care. And thankfully, what we're seeing across the board, that there are more conversations about this happening across the community. So that is nice to see. And at the same time, we still have work to do because, again, we're still combating some of these like socializations around what is perceived as Black and what is perceived as a man, and trying to navigate that in a way that's sensitive to all of these different realities, which could be a hindrance to those seeking access to mental health.
Yes, and so many great things that you just stated, and it made me think of one of the preliminary conversations we had in preparation for this conversation. I think it might have been John Rollins who stated it, but a lot of the times when we're servicing our Black student population, our Black men, they know that they can go to class, they can do their homework, they can do the degree stuff. It's a lot of the other stuff in the societal context that they sit in that causes a lot of the stress and the negative mental health effects. I think of, I mean, even this past week, we had the tragic murder of Sonia Massey, and these
Mm,
things that we consistently see
yep.
in the news and the media, to
Yeah.
where there's just so much else that's affecting us as men, as people, as humans, that makes it hard to focus on that assignment that you may or may not care about for a general education requirement. And I think
Yeah.
that the more that we have this intersectional framework, the more that we talk about Black men in the college environment in the context of all these issues, the
Mm,
more that we can see how these things are laying on top of each other and having collective impact, for lack of a better word, on Black
yeah.
men's college mental health.
For sure, for sure. And I think that that is, like you said, the intersectional framework is so important. And I think that's the reason why, even in this presentation that I gave last spring to the UCSD community, I was really intentional about trying to think about this collectively versus individually, right? And I think that part of it is really how do we look for those openings to say to
Mhm.
folks, here's where you can stick in and stick your hands in here and get the love and the care around Black college men at a form a more collective approach versus like you over here doing something and I'm over here doing something. Let's all come together because that's the way in the nature of the Black community in general, right? And so trying to think about that more expansively is what I hope to see in future iterations, even and when we're thinking about EDI or DEI work in terms of thinking about it more collectively versus a siloed entity doing all of the work.
Absolutely. And I think it's easy sometimes for institutions as large as a UC San Diego to kind of naturally form these different silos based off of specifically what their department works on. Like, oh, you go to your academic advisor for these things, and they're only focused on
Mm-hmm.
these academic advising standards. Working at the Black Resource Center is like, oh, we have a very specific mission that we're serving. But at the end of the day, kind of like to think in the forward, these are all our children. Like, we have to make sure that there are
Yeah.
warm handoffs to different departments, that we're connecting people to people and not just students to the institution. Because I think one of the things that was very crucial for us at the Black Resource Center was that if we're going to direct a student to go to the financial aid office or to CAPS, our counseling and psychological services, we're specifically saying like, hey, there's this human being that works in this
Mm-hmm.
department, and I want to make
Yeah.
sure that you're connected with this person more than
Yeah.
just pushing you out into the world and saying go figure it out.
Yes, that part. That part is so true. I remember I was an administrator. That's where I was very like hands-on about that. Like I remember when I got on certain campuses, especially anytime I was on a new campus that I was starting out for the first year, I was like, I want to get to know as many people as I can so that I can like one, build a relationship with these folks because I need to know who's who, but also be able to say to students if they ever needed help, here's someone who I know, right? And I can hand you in a sense, like a warm transfer, right? Instead of
Mhm.
like coldly transferring someone to another department, I'm doing this warm transfer. And sometimes I would even go as far as saying, let me call this person before the student even goes over there so they know, right? What if there was like gaps or times where I couldn't do that? I was like, go over there, tell them my name, they will know, right? And so that's so important to have that kind of people interaction where folks can have a touch point across the institution versus kind of like these patches of folks in their own respective corners operating.
And I think that's a good introduction to getting a little bit more into the details about this collective impact approach. I think we did a good job of framing just the different connective tissues within a collective impact approach and how it takes a village, it takes multiple people. But thinking about the equity and mental health session that you led last spring, what were some of those strategies that you shared on how institutions like UC San Diego can put forward a collective impact approach as it pertains to the mental health of our Black college men?
Yeah, so I think the collective impact strategy is really about a strategy that is interested in making sure that there is a collective or shared common goal or goals to achieve social justice outcomes, right? And so, really trying to think about from a holistic standpoint, what does it mean to build this culture of care in terms of giving folks the information that they need, right? But then also the confidence that they need to make sure that they can connect the dots across the board. And so what I discussed in that presentation was essentially thinking about the ways that higher education administrators could work across the aisle in a sense, right? Using some
Mhm.
of the political terms there. Um, and thinking like in terms of like not saying again, like your office does the Black Resource Center stuff, right? And my office does the financial aid counseling stuff or the mental health counseling stuff. Um, it is about how do we think of collectively how to get students together or proactively, but also reactively, right? Because sometimes there's situations you just can't anticipate, but how do you help across the board for folks to see that this is a common goal that we want to strategize around and get the resources needed. One of the big strategies that I oftentimes talk about when I did this presentation, I talked about the ability to leverage internal partnerships, which means all across
Mhm.
departmentals. But here's one that I know that is a proven strategy that most institutions are using a lot these days, especially with tighter budgets. External partners, right? Like who in the community can you tap to say, these are some resources that we need. You have this resource. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can partner, right? In my work around HBCUs and looking at the inclusion strategies used to make inclusive campus for students, for LGBTQIA students, I notice oftentimes like they're partnering with advocacy groups in this local area. They're partnering with the national organization, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, to offer trainings and opportunities for students to connect across different institutions, and even leaders at the institutions can attend trainings. Similarly, there are organizations such as Omega Psi Phi, right? Like they have an initiative, which is a Black letter Greek organization, but they have an initiative where they are passionate about making sure that Black men or men in their fraternity in general have access to mental health care. And so they have a partnership where they've done that, where local chapters are intentional about connecting their fraternity members with these resources. I'm sure, right? Like if we look at the grand scheme of things, that there are opportunities to partner with organizations that are passionate, just as passionate about that, and figuring out ways to fill in kind of the institutional gaps, right, around what services or what's offered. I think the prime example of the way that you all are doing this work at UCSD is having these conversations where folks can learn from other folks, right? and having a centralized space and time where these conversations could be happening, and to be intentional about to center uh, different pockets or segments of student populations. And so, like, the kinds of interconnected ways that internal and external partnerships can work together to fill in some of these gaps will be so critical to making sure that we're doing a better job of taking care of our students.
Yeah, and I think that, like you mentioned, it has to come down to wanting to take care of our students, to take care of the community, and
Mm,
just that type of collectivism to where um, students know that they have true advocates, people in spaces
yes,
that are truly working towards their own benefit, working towards their success. And I think it's so critical for us to be able to continue to have these conversations and take these conversations outside of spaces like the equity and mental health session or outside of this podcast recording and really put them into action in our departments, which leads to me
yes.
wondering if throughout your session, and just what you know about UC San Diego, you mentioned this is a potential or an avenue where we're doing work to spread knowledge and spread information. Was there anything that you learned about our campus or that stood out about our campus during your session that you think that folks listening to this can put into practice, or perhaps you have resources that you might be able to share for folks who are wanting to put this into action on our campus?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I had an opportunity to attend and be in community with some of the Black queer collectives, and also I went to the LGBT Resource Center on campus. I did another event too on campus where I tried to do like a mixtape on mental health, Black men's mental health. And one of the things I thought was really interesting too about that entire experience is that there seemed to be some synergy around the work that you all are doing to support your students. And I was wondering, man, what would it look like for them to think about this holistically? Has there been any um, like intentional meetings and to
Mm,
drive like collective strategy around supporting students across the board. But then thinking about for Black college men, how do you? It's always because there's always this perception that Black college men don't show up for things
mhm,
and that they don't want to be involved. And I oftentimes would question that to say, how do we have conversations with students, Black college men, right, in particular, to say, what is it that you want and how can we help to work with you to achieve it? And maybe it might not be that I come in and do a session, that they come in and do a session and lead it, and I'm there to help facilitate it, right? I wonder if there are more opportunities for folks to show up and to not put the onus on students because they already have a lot on their plate, but to help like see them as partners, right, in this whole process, because uh, they hold valuable knowledge, right? They have information that we need to know in order to make this work. And I think that it takes intentional like uh, relationship building. It
mm,
takes intentional time outside of trying to strategize around this stuff. Like I think sometimes I wonder if even as me as a professor, would it make sense for me not to always think about something in my classroom being an assessment of their learning, right? But
mm,
rather for them to just show up and to have space to process and talk through if it's classwork stuff, but somehow it's related to their personal life. Yeah, we can have those conversations. Or is there ways for folks to just, come together and not feel like we're always extracting something from them or
mhm,
wanting them to engage in something? And I think it's challenging because of COVID-19, right? All of us got so used to sitting behind the screen and, not having to actually engage. And I wonder what this new kind of opportunity could present itself in terms of how do we engage folks so that they feel like however they show up is welcomed and at the same time it meets their needs.
mhm. I appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate the conversation about Black men, quote unquote, not showing up in some of these spaces because,
Yeah,
like you said, a lot of it just comes down to conversation sometimes. And
yeah,
obviously, folks are busy and have their own schedules, but also have their own values and what's important and needed for
Yeah.
them. I think back at a time where we had our Black Men's Collective at UC San Diego, and we had a group of like 10 to 12 Black students, staff, and faculty coming
Mm,
together in a space. And we didn't really even know what we wanted the Black Men's Collective to be, but we knew it was nice to just be in that space and talk with a professor who might be 30, 40 years older than me and say, like, hey, what was your experience like in college? Let's have these
yeah.
intentional conversations. And like you said, where there's not necessarily an assessment or a goal at the end of it, but just having these organic, community-based conversations. Because I
Yes.
think, speaking personally from my experiences as a Black man in higher education, sometimes when very well-meaning people put together certain programs that focus on Black men, sometimes it can feel like you're under a microscope and have a
Hmm.
microphone to you like, oh, tell me about your experience, potentially
Yeah.
reliving past trauma or just going through things that
Yeah.
you might not necessarily just want to do in the moment because we're still
Yeah.
growing, we're still learning as individuals. And so I say all that to say, when you think of people who have the right intentions, they agree with the need of a collective impact approach, where do folks start with having those conversations? Where do folks start
Hmm.
with learning more about intersections of a Black male identity for college mental health? What advice would you give, or what are some best practices?
Yeah, I feel like one of the things I know that it's also hard to do is read these days, right? I've gotten into a bunch of like audiobooks. One of the recent audiobooks that I read was, it's called Heavy. And I'm blanking on the author's name right now. But Heavy is this it's this incredibly brave book, right? The author is talking through his lived experiences of being a Black man living in the South and having to navigate issues of racism, right? Trying to make sense of his gender identity, all of his sexual identity, right? And all of these like components, his body image, right? All of these things that are just so um, coming at him at once. He's, came from a home that was uh, single parent, right? But had other influences like his grandmother, and also realizing through his journey that he wasn't really attentive to his own mental health needs. He was having some social challenges, right, that were showing up in his life that he normalized. And I think for a lot of us, we normalize our reality because we're used to that, right? That's what we've grown to understand and what we've been able, what we've had to navigate. And so he talks about his journey with therapy in some of it, talks about even how when he was in therapy and his therapist was trying to get him to understand, right? Like how his life had been informed by so many of these external factors, how he couldn't even process in his mind that what he was experiencing wasn't normal, right? Or wasn't the most healthiest conditions for him to be in. Um, and so, like, all of that to say, like, I love the fact that folks are writing these stories or telling these stories about their lived experiences because for me, it brings like this thing that I could read on a scholarly paper that seems so distant, right? Because we're in academia trying to intellectualize something. It brings it such to a home base where folks can be invited in to have these kind of introspective kind of conversations, but also
Mm,
conversations across other folks who may be interested in unpacking this, right? So reading for sure. The other thing that I think folks can do is to start the conversation with and for Black college men, right? I think being in community and having Black college men at the table to have these conversations, not to divulge, right, necessarily of their traumas or things like that, but to have conversation about what it is that they need and what it is that they've been navigating while they're there to figure out collectively with the folks who are responsible for being leaders on campus how to do this work better, enhance it,
mhm,
right? I think the major thing though is that relationship building piece is so key and important because as I stated earlier about just the stigma around mental health in the Black community, having that rapport with folks will be so central to the success of any initiative or anything that any practice. I also think that it's not just about practice. It's
Mm,
about policy. So policy in particular is so important because it sets the tone. It guides the ways that folks interact and engage in the space. And one of the things that I've been very, very persistent about, even as a faculty member now, is what are we doing to make sure that our students have access to
mm,
healthcare? Is our policies in our student health insurance policies, all of those, are they sound? How are folks experiencing that? Are there barriers to accessing mental health? Um, for instance, for Black trans folks who decide to, Black trans men who decide to undergo the transition process, however that may be for them, right? Oftentimes there's a requirement that they have counseling
mm.
before they go through that process. I've talked to so many institutions who don't have something like that in place for folks. So then there are barriers, right? Sometimes having to go 4 or 5 hours away from the city where the school is located because there are no providers that can offer that type of competency around supporting Black trans folks who are thinking about or considering the transition process, right? And so all of that to say, there is this need to really think about policy and practice and how they walk hand in hand and have oftentimes implications for how Black college men experience their time in terms of their mental health.
Yes, thank you for that. And I looked up Heavy, and I think the author that you might be referring to is Keith Layman. Does that ring a
Yes,
bell?
Keith Lane. Yes, that's him. That's him. Yeah, yeah. It's a really, really, really great book. I would recommend anybody to read it because when you hear, and I love the audio book. If you do audio,
Mm,
that is it's even more powerful because he reads the text, right? So he really does a good job of recounting his lived experiences and really trying to not blatantly tell you this is where he realized he wasn't taking care of his mental health. He kind of just drops the nugget there, right?
mhm,
And then you're like, oh, you kind of think through it, right? And he does it from a standpoint that I think is intersectional because he talks about his blackness, his manhood, and his boyhood, but also the ways that it showed up for him in his body and the size of it, right? And what does that mean for him growing up and how he saw and interacted with the world. And so I think that's a really good text that if anyone wanted to kind of get an understanding of one kind of nuance to a Black man's life, that he lets folks into the window of that very, very nicely. And I think that he does it in a way that he tries to tell these like funny stories, but also like make it impactful in a sense where he's trying to get the point across that, as Black men, you got to take care of our mental health.
and so that's Heavy, Keith Layman, Kieselayman. And I think that just you talking about how powerful with him reading the audio version of the book and just having that narrative, it makes me think of the fact that when it comes to reading as a resource, we have to make sure that we keep in mind that we don't always have to reinvent the wheel either, because Black men, Black trans men, Black queer men, of course, we're centering these identities, but Black folks in general have always been sharing our narratives about our experiences. There's
Yeah.
research available, there's literature available, and I would
Mm-hmm.
call on the UCSD folks listening in to utilize some of the resources that exist on our campus. Recently, UC San Diego had the Enhancing the Black Student Experience Symposium, where a
Mm,
variety of different books and articles were shared that focus on the experiences of our students. The Black Student Union at UC San Diego had issued demands at various points in UC San Diego's history about their experiences on campus. So I
mm,
encourage folks to engage intellectually with this material because these narratives are out there, these stories are out there, and I think it's important for us to center and truly listen to what these folks are saying about their experiences too, and not just take it at a face value, understanding, even though we're having this conversation, talking about some of the context that we exist in as Black men, just because a student is saying these things doesn't necessarily mean that they have the language to talk about all the systems that are at play. And
Yeah.
so I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure that we talk through like stories and storytelling as a very
Mhm.
important tool for people to utilize that doesn't
Yeah.
require you to put somebody under a microscope. You can learn with some of the resources that are already available.
Yeah. Yeah. And then one of the things too that is a big strategy for the collective impact approach is really thinking too about what are the shared goals and the metrics, right? How are you going to assess what you've done? And so as a campus community, getting input into what is important for administrators to consider when thinking about assessing programs and services or policies,
Hmm.
and then implementing that a strategy to do that assessment on a yearly basis or however you need to do it. Because the data, I think, is one of those things that we think about it in a way that I think it's always like numbers, right? And yes, that's a part of it. It could be a part of it, the doing surveys. But again, storytelling is also a big thing, right? Like that is a big component of really how information is passed down in the Black community, right? And thinking about the stories, the collective stories, the individual stories that are present, and like you said, going back through those documents of the demands that folks have asked for or the experiences that folks have reported on can leave you with a sense of where do we need to go? What information do we still not know? And how do we get there? But we have to listen, right? We have to pay
Hmm.
attention to those things. And if we don't, then we miss those important opportunities to show up for students.
Absolutely. So as we get to the tail end of our conversation, which has been very robust and I'm definitely enjoying our dialogue, and you've been gracious with your time, there's one last topic that I wanted to make sure we discuss, and that's the role of music. You alluded to
Yes.
earlier the Black Men's Mental Health mixtape. As
Yeah.
I was reviewing your PowerPoint, you also had a bullet point on there about being a fierce defender and member of the Beehive.
Yes.
So wanted to make sure that we left room to talk about the role of music in all of this as a fun way to
Yeah.
end the conversation. And I also thought it was interesting as I was looking back at the flyer for the event that you had Love Yours as part of the title for the
Yeah.
workshop. And when I was a student, myself and another intern, Cambria, we held a Love Yours event as well. So it's funny that we have this shared
Yeah.
single by J. Cole as kind of a platform for
Yeah.
conversation. But what are your thoughts on the role of music in the realm of the conversation that we're having?
This music is oftentimes what I say, and people have said this, so it's not my quote, but like that it imitates life, right? Like art imitates life, and it is a universal language that transcends time, transcends geographical boundaries, and all of those things. And I think that oftentimes I try to find ways to do that with my classes. I taught my first year HBCU course where I was trying to celebrate and acknowledge some of the contributions that HBCUs and some of the other historically marginalized, racially marginalized institutions have experienced right throughout their time in this world in terms of higher ed. And I centered it around Beyonce's Homecoming, right?
Mm.
Project that she put out in 2018 for Coachella. And I can tell you that when we had those conversations in class, things sounded differently than when they do in my other classes because I think folks were able to relate to the music in a way that helped them to communicate their thoughts. They saw the connectivity
Mhm.
to some of the concepts like that she talked about, even in that documentary. And so I think about music as a vehicle to have conversations that are oftentimes like sometimes taboo or sometimes not as socially acceptable to have in large or public spaces. And so music has, for me personally, been a saving grace, right? For me, I know I wouldn't have survived many of the things that I've had to endure in my lifetime if it were not for music that spoke to me at certain points of my life. And I always try to see that as a window, an opportunity for it to kind of open the door in a conversation and to bring folks into the fold. And I would say that I think when I taught that one course at Utah around HBCUs and the other um, serving institutions that are geared at serving racial and marginalized organizations or students rather, um, it was a very good way at the end of the semester. We did a mixtape. So that's kind of like me thinking about how do I continue this mixtape thing when I did it at UCSC. And I told students, yes, you centered Beyonce in this whole thing, but bring me your stuff. Like I want to hear what music you're listening to and what songs resonate with you as you're thinking through some of these modules that you had some pretty lengthy time engaging with. And so, I mean, folks brought in music around their culture. Native American student who brought in some like Native American rap that I hadn't even heard of, right? And that was
Mm.
like interesting because I was able to like incorporate that into some of my appetite of music, right? Folks, I knew of Post Malone, but like Post Malone is from Utah, so like people love him there too. And so some folks were bringing in stuff like that, and I was like, oh, interesting. And the ways that they were connecting with the music and the material spoke volumes to the power that music has. And so I try to incorporate that in multiple classes now where folks can literally, we create playlists now in my classes for they read a material that they're like, this made me angry. What song can you connect that to, right? And let's talk about why it made you angry. Or this made me happy. Or this made me feel a sense of connection. Or, and I have them tie it to a song that they find relevant to that topic. So
Mm.
music is powerful. It is a universal language. It imitates life. And I think it's so important to think about how do we connect um, across boundaries that we put in our head that, one has to be in this space in order to exist, right? And they can't cross over. No, you can. And this is how, right? Let's have the conversation through music. And that's one of my ways of doing that.
Having a conversation through music. As an artist, as a creative myself, I couldn't agree more. Kendrick Lamar is kind of my beehive. Like I love
Yeah.
just listening to some of his experiences as a black male from Compton. I'm from the city of Los
Yeah.
Angeles. Just thinking through engaging with the lyrics of his music and some of those
Yeah.
experiences and the
Yeah.
emotion that come into these, like some of the frustration you hear, some of the sadness that you hear. And I think that when you talk about music imitating life and art imitating life, it's that empathy, those shared experiences that really can bring us together as a community. And as Black folks, for a lot of Black folks, music is so important to our identities, to our upbringing, which is
Yes.
why the BRC, the Black Research Center, will always be one of my favorite spaces on campus because you go into the
Yeah.
BRC, the music's playing, and you go into a lot of
Yes.
space on campus, they might not have music, but you come to the BRC, you're going to hear something. If Beyonce just dropped, you're going to hear the Beyonce album. If
Yes.
there's a song
Yeah.
out, you're going to hear that song out. And when I was a staff member there, there was certain mornings where it might be a rough week. I'd turn on the beatbox in the morning. I'm playing Earth, Wind, and Fire. I want the students to walk
Yes.
in, hear that soulful
Yes.
music when they come into the space. So definitely just
Yeah.
love that conversation about the role of music in all of this because music truly can have a positive impact on mental health. And as you mentioned, give a platform for discussion, which is a lot of times all we can ask for, just
Yeah.
having these platforms for these conversations.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I love that. I love the way that music can just like speak and make, like you said, you can come in and have the worst day in the world or the tough week, and you put on that one song. For me, I love uh, Joy and Pain
Mm.
by the Gap King, right? Like that is like my favorite song if I need just a quick pick me up, right? If I'm having a really challenging day or just a day that I'm really happy, right? I will turn that song on because I want to just feel or capture that feeling in a song, right? And it make it a thing where it just does something for my mental health. So for sure, I agree with you 100% there.
Definitely going to put on my favorite playlist after this podcast recording.
Yes, me
Jarrell,
too.
you've you've been a joy to have this conversation with. Definitely have enjoyed just talking to you. And my favorite thing about the Equity and Mental Health podcast series is that, of course, I'm facilitating this dialogue for the listeners, but I think just being able to internalize the dialogue, have the conversation myself. I also don't want to sleep on the fact that I've mentioned this before, but two Black men being able to have this
Yes.
conversation, two Black men who both work in higher education and having this
Mhm.
platform, I think is very important and can never go understated. So my final question for you is just how can people follow up with you, and as well as what do you hope people are taking away from this conversation?
Yes, so if you want to follow up with me, I'm available. You can do so at www.jarrel, Jarrel, T Johnson .com. So that's Jarrell T Johnson .com. I'm wanting to say my email address, and I'm like, why am I wanting to say that? And then you can contact me via email at Jarrell, Jarrel Johnson at utah.edu. I'm always available to talk. And yeah, I'm on Twitter, or now X, right? At Jarrell is Jarrelt Johnson. So definitely feel free to connect with me on there as well, and I will engage with you. And then what I'm hoping for, I want to leave an affirmation,
Mm,
particularly for Black college men and Black folks, period, is that I want to affirm that you deserve the love, the care, and all of the things that your heart desires in a world that tells you no, right? Tells you or tries to strip you of those things. And I hope that you find the spaces where you are being poured into and that you are loved and that you're cared for and that you feel like you have the support. That's my deepest, deepest hope.
mm.
And I pray that I just hope that this continues to grow and folks see this as an imperative to really take form and take control of supporting the community. And for those who might not identify within the community, I will say that you have just as much responsibility to make sure that this happens. And so, however, this needs to occur, right? I hope that you will join the fight and to make it happen too.
Ashe. I think that was
Yeah.
beautifully stated. Dr. Jarrell T. Johnson, JarrellTJohnson.com. Thank you for your time, listeners. Thank you all for engaging with our conversation. Calling on you all as a call to action to share this episode with other staff members across campus or other folks in your network, because I think this is a conversation, although we focus on UC San Diego a lot, this is a conversation that can impact anybody anywhere. Also want to
Yes.
make sure that I state that this series overall was made possible by funding from the University of California Office of the President, with the goal to foster a campus culture of health and well-being where students, faculty, staff, and other members of our community can thrive. To learn about other upcoming events in the Equity and Mental Health series, as well as to check out our prior episodes of the podcast, visit diversity.ucsd.edu, and you can find the Equity and Mental Health tab under EDI resources. Once again, that's diversity.ucsd.edu, Equity and Mental Health under EDI resources. Thank you all for listening. Dr. Jarrell, thank you for your time, and we will catch y'all next time.
Thank you.